Hello and welcome. Today we would like to talk about suffering. So, previously we have talked about what is suffering and already established a lot of points. In other podcast episodes, such as what is love and what is friendship, we have also talked about suffering. Suffering seems to be a fundamental issue and a concept and principle of our lives, which we will always encounter again and again. So there will be many more episodes that will cover suffering in one way or another. And it can be found in many topics and is a fundamental part of life. So, what I would like to do today is I would like to present an uncompleted draft of a sort of ultimate guide to suffering. Now, we already have similar ones through Buddhism, for example, and Hinduism, where we have the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path in Buddhism. But here I would like to talk about different kind of suffering or from a different light and angle and viewpoint. So we would like to start with a short recitation of a collection of ideas that I've come about in my meditation. All is suffering. Suffering is life. Life is suffering. We are born into suffering of separation. We are born into suffering of isolation. We are born into suffering of incompleteness. We are born into suffering of desire and relationship. We are born into suffering of limitation. We are born into suffering of struggling. We are born into suffering of change. And we are born into suffering of existence and being. Now, I would like to talk quickly about each of those types of suffering and those points of suffering. First, we have suffering from separation. What is suffering from separation? Suffering from separation is that suffering that comes about because we are separated from God. We are separated from the absolute and the ultimate principle of existence. So there is the absolute, but we exist in the world that is not absolute, that is trivial, and that is separated from the absolute. So in Hindu religion, we talk about the suffering coming from Maya, that is the world of illusion, where we do not realize that Brahman, the ultimate reality of things, that is one and a wholeness. In Christianity, we talk about being separated from God through being ejected from the Garden of Eden, so Eden, and that we are now living in a world that is separated from God. And we seek this reunification with God through our prayer and through other rituals. In Buddhism, or rather in Hinduism, we seek reunification with God through meditation mostly, and through other virtues and practices from ethics. We are thrown into samsara. So, samsara is the part of life that is like a wheel. It keeps turning and turning. It's the mortal life, it's mortal existence. And we are thrown into that existence from an existence that used to be perfect and absolute. So, the existence of Brahman and the existence of the one and only. We are thrown into suffering, we are thrown into tension, we are naked and freezing. We are thrown out of the Garden of Eden into this world that is full of suffering and where everything is suffering. And this separation from God is one of the fundamental sufferings that each of us can observe in meditation. Now, for many people, they will not realize that they suffer from this because it takes a bit of meditation to get to the core of things. But being separated from God brings with it a fundamental suffering that feels like birth. So, birth itself is very traumatic, It is the splitting from union with the mother in the womb, in the perfect Garden of Eden, into an existence that is cold, it is naked, and we are dependent on ourselves. Now, that is the first type of suffering, suffering from separation from God. The second type of suffering is suffering from isolation. That is also very fundamental suffering. It is that where we suffer because we are isolated from other things. We are isolated from other people, we are isolated from animals, plants, rocks, the universe, and we are isolated in body and in mind and in soul. So we exist in this shell that we call our body and in this mind that is like water, but we can never truly meet the other. The other is always outside of our grasp. And this situation brings about it one of the most fundamental sufferings that we all experience, and which is also one of the most fundamental sufferings that guide our daily life. So, when we desire to be with friends, we try to overcome the suffering from isolation. When we try to gain objects that make us feel better, we try to overcome the suffering from isolation because ultimately the isolation is that which really torments the soul. So we are separated from the other, we are separated in body, we are separated in mind, we are isolated in ourselves, and we can never meet the other. And that kind of suffering motivates us in many ways to behave the way that we humans behave, with trying to seek closeness to others, trying to find comfort, trying to fill our lives with music and art and games and theater, and trying to fill our lives with other people. Then there is the third suffering, suffering from incompleteness. This suffering has to do with the fact that we are born incomplete. We are born with one side and we are born split. So, what that means is that we are not only born incomplete in the sense of being not part of the ultimate and absolute, but we are also born in a sort of horizontal manner in an incomplete way. So, we are born as either male or female, which is one of the parts of being horizontally incomplete. And that part is one in which we try to find the other that complements us, that fulfills us, that makes us feel whole. So, all kinds of romantic relationships and marriage, for example, are an example of this, where we try to find the other and try to fulfill ourselves in finding completeness in our horizontal incompleteness. Now, the fourth kind of suffering is suffering from limitation. Now, this goes without saying that we are heavily limited in everything that we are and do and can be. So, we are limited in our power of the mind and in our power of the body. We need to eat, we need to do things, we need to sleep, we need to fight, we need to go buy groceries, we need to work, and we need to establish our thoughts. We need to think, we need to analyze, and we need to philosophize in order to stretch these limitations, in order to enlarge the way that our minds and bodies function. So, this limitation is suffering in that we are constantly fighting against other forces. And we are fighting against forces that have way less limitations than us, such as diseases, weather, and the universe as a whole. So we are born powerless in the face of power. We are born with constraints. We are born in bodies that have constraints. We are born in bodies that age, that get older, that eventually will die. The mind has constraints. So all of this is part of our suffering of being limited in the sense of our abilities. Then there is suffering from struggle. All is struggling. All is a tension, a fight between two opposing forces. All is a dynamic between light and dark, between yin and yang. And we are born into this, and everything in ourselves is part of this struggle. So, whatever we do, there is always a fight undergoing in us. And we suffer from this in that we are never purely at rest. We have no equilibrium really, except for very high states of existence such as nirvana and moksha. So all is struggling, all has intrinsic struggle, and all struggles between the extremes. All is made incomplete, all is in motion. So everything that exists is always in motion. Nothing exists in a standstill environment. Even things that we observe to be standing still, they will move at some point again. So there are always forces that bring everything into motion and that bring about the breaking of an equilibrium state in everything. And that fact that nothing remains the same brings about suffering for us. All is impermanent, and there are two hemispheres in us without a middle that doesn't exist. So these hemispheres, they always fight against each other. They always try to struggle between one and the other extreme and try to find a balance. But this balance is always temporary. There is always a point where balance is broken and where we start to suffer again. And everything is in relation. So there is no thing that exists isolated purely, but everything is an interplay of things together. So, for example, we humans cannot live isolated, but we are always in a relationship to every other human in some way or another. And which we also had to find out with globalization that what we do in, for example, Europe will affect people in Africa, will affect people in Asia and other places in the world, and counterclockwise as well, the other way around, vice versa. There is also no absolute nor certainty. So there is suffering because there is no such thing as absolute certainty for nobody. And everything that has been stated before can be refuted and has been refuted. And that is one of the things that we find through philosophy, that there is no such thing as certainty. And we somehow have to live with this uncertainty and with the fact that there is no absolute that we can hold on to. There is no one truth that we can hold on to. There is suffering from desire and relationship. So, what does this mean? It means that we desire things and we are in relationships with them. So, for example, we desire existence, we desire others, we are bound to others, we are bound to things. We are dependent on interaction, we are dependent on cooperation, we are dependent on the other and on their independence. We need food. So, for example, food. We desire an object that we can consume and eat, absorb, and transform in us. But in that, we face the problem that that other, the food, is outside of our control. And we have to fight to get that. If we, for example, want to eat a cow, then we first need to hunt the cow. We need to slaughter it and we need to prepare the food in order to consume it. No cow will ever stand there and just wait to be slaughtered. The same with plants. Plants have defensive mechanisms. They hide their fruits, they have poison, they have thorns, and they are contested by other animals that want to eat them as well. So we are dependent on things that are outside of our control and that cause us suffering ultimately. We are dependent on this interaction. So we are dependent that other things interact with us. But because they are the other, we cannot control them. So we need to have a certain type of opportunity that the other will cooperate with us, which they don't always want or can or will do. And that brings about suffering. So, for example, when you want to do something with a friend, you want to go to the cinema or you want to simply hang out or do something, then the other friend can always say that they don't want to do that. And that brings about suffering because you desire something, but another will maybe not want to do the same things. Then there is suffering from change. So, this is also one of the sufferings that we find in Buddhism. So, it is suffering from change. Basically, all is impermanent and all good turns into bad. So, whenever we have something, we will lose it at some point or another. Whether it's a relationship to a human, whether it's a relationship to an immaterial object, an artifact or something, or whether it's our own health, or whether it's existence itself. Everything changes and we will lose everything at one point. At the latest, when we're dead, we will lose it. All that is obtained will have to be let go at some point. So there is nothing that we can keep forever. Everything will have to be let go. And that causes suffering. Every birth results in death. And we cling to death, not living in the present, and we cling to the future, not living in the present. So, for example, we may have, let us say that we have a book that we really love, but due to our mishandling of it, it will slowly degrade and wither apart. Now, if we get sad about this, and cannot let go of the fact that the book is destroyed, we will suffer from this because we cling to something that is dead. It cannot fulfill us anymore. It's no longer the book. It is a collection of papers, but it is no longer the book that we wanted. So clinging to this brings about great suffering. And clinging to a future that we're afraid of also brings about great suffering. Now, there is one more suffering, and that is the final one, the suffering from being and existence. That is the most fundamental of all of these sufferings. Namely, that it is existent in everything, it is all pervasive. And it is also similar to what Buddhists say as being the all pervasive suffering, which exists in us simply by existing. So, it is a suffering that we cannot get rid of, and is suffering that follows each and every single one of us, and no one is spared from this, from the moment that they're born to the moment that they're dead. So, being is suffering, and suffering is being. Existence seeks eternity, but can never achieve it. Fundamentally, what existence wants is to remain existent. But in existence, there is always the counterforce of non existence. And this counterforce is with us from the moment we are born. The moment we create something, it starts to wither away and get old, and at some point will be dead and non existent anymore. The moment we start a relationship to a person is the moment where the relationship starts to get old and at one point be no more. Every cell in us struggles to exist. So this existence suffering is the most pervasive and the most fundamental suffering of all of them. Because through existing, we suffer. So every cell in our body, in every moment of our lives, is struggling to remain alive, is struggling to work and to force itself to be healthy. It's constantly doing something, it's constantly at work, it's constantly striving and constantly in hardship. So every little part of us is in suffering all the time. And all of these parts will also perish at the end because all of this struggling has its final result in death. It is never in life that struggling fulfills itself, but always in death. The tiniest for those of you who meditate and who may have made this experience, the tiniest vibrations of the mind are suffering. So even if we are still in our mind, the tiny vibrations that come up and that we can notice are a type of suffering. It makes us feel pain, it makes us want to do something, it makes us ask questions, it makes us constantly strive for something else than what is in the moment. It is never satisfied with what there already is. And the breathing, the very fact that we breathe and our heartbeat are also suffering. It is very hard and difficult for our lungs and for our heart to breathe and to beat all this time. And at some point, it will be tired, and the lungs and the heart will no longer have the strength and power to work anymore, and they will die. And then our being, our body dies in its entirety. So it is important to notice that these existential sufferings are sufferings that we always carry with us and which never leave our side. Some of them can be overcome with more or less ease. For example, we can say that the suffering of isolation can be overcome through meditation with the other, which I've also talked about previously in another episode, where we meditate on each other, where we see each other, and where we recognize that the other exists. The suffering from separation can be overcome through worship of God and meditation on God, so that we can unify with God to be one and to achieve oneness with everything. But not everything can be achieved like this. Suffering from desire can be achieved and from change can be achieved through non attachment, through trying not to cling to attachment to things. But for example, suffering from being, from existence itself, cannot be overcome by itself. We are born to die and we will die, and there is nothing we can do about it. There are only ways to alleviate the pain, but we cannot overcome it in the sense that we will never suffer from this anymore. At the latest, when we die, we will suffer it again. And only those who achieve great levels of meditation may be able to overcome it to some extent. So these kind of suffering should not be mistaken with trivial suffering. So suffering that is, for example, I hit my toe and therefore it hurts, or I'm hungry, therefore I eat, or I had a bad day, therefore I will do something about it and it will get better. They're not these kind of sufferings. They're underlying all of these sufferings, and which are also spoken about in Buddhism, in clinging to things, and in the suffering from suffering, and suffering from change, and the all pervasive suffering, where clinging to things is one of the fundamental problems that we have, that we suffer from because we attach to things in life. So, this is a short introduction to a sort of bigger view on the topic of suffering. I would like to expand on this. I would like to establish the points for and against the suffering, so that there is also the solution included in everything, as well as I would like to precisify more, and I would like to add more details to every point, so with examples, so that it's better understood. And I would like to also draw parallels to other traditions, teachings such as Buddhism and Hinduism and Christianity, where we can say that suffering is intrinsic to our lives. And it can be very difficult for people to come to terms with this suffering and with the reality that all is suffering, because people may say that they don't want suffering to be fundamental. And that is a very clear and well understood aversion to suffering and to truth, but nonetheless, it is important that we realize that all is ultimately embedded in a web of suffering, and that the ways out of this can be achieved, but it requires a lot of practice and training and work, and not everyone has the same capacity, ability to do that in the same way, and needs more patience to deal with it. And also, it is difficult for people to accept that all is suffering because they may feel like they have a good life, they're happy. But the problem is that this happiness and this good life is simply a louder melody that plays over a very sad melody in the background. And the sad melody itself doesn't go away, it simply gets overshadowed by a happier melody. And that is also what we try to do. We always try to fill ourselves with some kind of happiness, with joy, with content, and we try to amass things around us and collect things such that we do not hear the suffering. But the moment when we are alone, or the moment when we go into deeper meditation, we can feel the suffering coming up again. So our culture is one that is based on distractions and on denial. And that does not really help with the suffering per se, although it can alleviate it momentarily. But people still suffer from the fundamental issues underlying them. And they cannot overcome them simply by distraction. But there is to be done work in oneself to overcome suffering. So I would like to leave it at that for the moment, and I wish you a great day. Thank you.